It's 1940, and the most powerful Air Force commander in the world is laughing at America. Hermann Göring, the corpulent, medal-adorned Reichsmarschall of Nazi Germany, sits in his opulent office, surrounded by looted art and the trappings of absolute power. His Luftwaffe has just crushed Poland in weeks, demolished the French Air Force, and is preparing to bring Britain to its knees. And when he hears about Franklin Roosevelt's audacious plan to build 50,000 aircraft, he doesn't just dismiss it. He mocks it with a statement that would become one of history's most spectacular misjudgments. The Americans cannot build aeroplanes. They are very good at refrigerators and razor blades. That single sentence, dripping with contempt, encapsulates everything the Nazis believed about American industrial capacity. To Göring and his fellow Nazi leaders, the United States was a nation of soft consumers, incapable of the martial discipline required for modern warfare. They saw American society as decadent, divided by democracy, weakened by its diversity. The idea that this nation of shopkeepers and factory workers could challenge German military might seemed laughable. But what happened next would transform that laughter into ashes. Because Hermann Göring was about to learn the most expensive lesson in industrial history, paid for with the destruction of his Luftwaffe, the devastation of his country, and ultimately his own disgrace and unaliving in a Nuremberg prison cell. This is the story of how spectacularly wrong one man could be, and how that wrongness helped change the course of human civilization. It's a tale of hubris meeting reality, of mockery transforming into terror, of a boast that aged like milk left in the desert sun. Hermann Göring's refrigerator, quote, would haunt him for the rest of his life, a reminder that sometimes the greatest military blunders aren't made on the battlefield, but in the fundamental misunderstanding of what your enemy is capable of achieving. So let's dive into this story, because it's not just about planes and production numbers. It's about the moment when Nazi Germany realized they'd picked a fight with an industrial colossus they couldn't possibly defeat. The context of Göring's mockery matters enormously because in early 1940, his confidence wasn't entirely misplaced. Hermann Wilhelm Göring wasn't just some pompous bureaucrat playing soldier. He was a genuine World War I flying ace, credited with 22 aerial victories, a recipient of the Pour le Mérite, Germany's highest military honor. He'd commanded the legendary Flying Circus Squadron after the death of the Red Baron himself. When Göring spoke about aviation, he spoke with the authority of someone who'd actually fought in the skies, who understood air combat viscerally, who'd built the Luftwaffe from nothing into what was, in 1940, the most formidable air force on the planet. And that Luftwaffe had just demonstrated its terrifying effectiveness. In September 1939, German aircraft had achieved total air superiority over Poland, enabling the blitzkrieg that conquered the country in just over a month. The synchronized dance of Stuka dive bombers and Messerschmitt fighters had shattered Polish resistance, turning military theory into devastating practice. Then came the spring of 1940, and the Luftwaffe's performance became even more impressive. Norway fell, Denmark capitulated in hours, and then the big prize came within reach. On May 10, 1940, the German assault on France and the Low Countries began, and Göring's aircraft were everywhere. The numbers from those early campaigns were genuinely staggering. The Luftwaffe entered the war with approximately 4,000 aircraft, a force carefully built over years of secret rearmament. They faced the combined air forces of France and Britain, and they won decisively. French airfields were cratered, aircraft destroyed on the ground. The vaunted Armée de l'Air essentially eliminated as an effective fighting force within weeks. By June, France was asking for an armistice, and the Luftwaffe had lost only a fraction of its strength. Göring had every reason to feel invincible. His air force had proven the decisive weapon of modern warfare, and he personally basked in Hitler's favor as the architect of these victories. This was the Hermann Göring who heard about Roosevelt's aviation plan, and this context explains why his dismissal seemed reasonable at the time. From his perspective, America was a distant, unmobilized nation with a tiny military. The United States Army Air Corps in 1939 possessed only about 1,200 combat aircraft, many of them obsolete. American fighter designs were years behind German engineering. The idea that this military backwater could somehow outproduce the mighty German war machine seemed absurd. The Americans had potential, sure, but potential means nothing against operational readiness. Or so Göring thought. But Roosevelt had seen something Göring hadn't. The American president understood that this war would be won not just by the bravery of soldiers or the genius of generals, but by the raw, productive capacity to simply overwhelm the enemy with materiel. And so, on May 16, 1940, just 6 days after the German assault on France began, Roosevelt stood before a joint session of Congress and made a declaration that shocked the nation and the world. He called for the production of 50,000 aircraft and the capacity to build 50,000 more every single year. Let me repeat that, because it's important to understand how audacious this goal was. 50,000 planes. Not total, but annually. To put this in perspective, total American aircraft production for military purposes in 1939 had been less than 3,000 planes. Roosevelt was calling for a more than 15-fold increase in production capacity, and he wanted it done essentially overnight, in the middle of the worst economic recovery in American history, in a nation that was overwhelmingly opposed to entering the war. The speech was delivered at a moment of maximum crisis. The German blitzkrieg was, at that very moment, racing across France. The British Expeditionary Force was about to be trapped at Dunkirk. The fall of France seemed imminent, and with it, the very real possibility that Britain would be forced to negotiate peace, leaving Nazi Germany as the master of Europe. Roosevelt's speech was electric with urgency. He spoke of ominous days and swift and shocking developments. He described how the brutal force of modern offensive war had been loosed in all its horror, how new powers of destruction, incredibly swift and deadly, had been developed. But more than fear, Roosevelt was selling hope through industrial might. He told Congress and the American people that they had to gear up to the ability to turn out at least 50,000 planes a year. He asked for an immediate appropriation of $896 million, and he hoped there would be speed in giving that appropriation. The number wasn't chosen arbitrarily. It was a number designed to be overwhelming, to signal to allies and enemies alike that America was preparing to enter this war not as a participant, but as the dominant industrial force. The reaction in America was mixed. Many thought Roosevelt was engaging in fantasy, that such production levels were physically impossible. The isolationists in Congress saw it as warmongering, an attempt to drag America into a European war that wasn't its business. The skeptics pointed out that you couldn't just will aircraft factories into existence, that the infrastructure didn't exist, that the skilled workers weren't available. They had a point. American industry in 1940 was still largely geared toward consumer goods. The factories that would need to produce war material were currently making automobiles, refrigerators, and yes, razor blades. The transformation Roosevelt was calling for would require nothing less than a complete reorganization of the American economy. Across the Atlantic, the reaction was even more extreme. In Britain, there was desperate hope that American production might eventually make a difference. In Germany, there was mockery and dismissal. This is where Hermann Göring's infamous quote comes in, though the exact timing and context of when he said it varies in different accounts. What's clear is that Göring and other Nazi leaders viewed Roosevelt's production goals as propaganda, as American bluster designed to make up for military weakness, with big talk. The idea that the Americans could build 50,000 aircraft seemed like a joke to men who'd spent years building what they considered the finest air force in the world. Göring's refrigerators and razor blades comment became part of Nazi propaganda. The message was clear. Americans were good at making consumer goods, at creature comforts, at the soft trappings of decadent capitalism. But when it came to the hard business of making weapons of war, when it came to the industrial discipline and technical sophistication required to build combat aircraft, the Americans were simply not in the same league as German engineers and workers. This view was reinforced by Nazi racial ideology, which held that American society, with its diverse population and democratic chaos, was inherently inferior to the disciplined, racially pure German Reich. But Göring's public mockery concealed a more complex reality. Hitler himself, whatever he said in public speeches, understood the danger that American industrial capacity represented. He knew that Germany's best chance for victory was to win quickly, before American production could be brought to bear. This is why the Nazis were so desperate to knock Britain out of the war in 1940, why the Battle of Britain was fought with such intensity. Hitler knew that every month Britain held out was another month for America to arm itself and its allies. But even Hitler, despite his private concerns, seemed to believe that American production, while eventually significant, could not match German efficiency and technical superiority. They were all about to be proven catastrophically wrong. The transformation of American industry that followed Roosevelt's speech was one of the most remarkable feats of organization in human history. It began almost immediately, though the results wouldn't be visible for months. William Knudsen, a Danish immigrant who'd worked his way up to become president of General Motors, was brought in to lead the production effort. His challenge was immense. Take an economy geared toward consumer goods and convert it to military production without causing economic collapse or social chaos. The solution was quintessentially American, a mixture of government coordination and private sector execution. Automobile manufacturers were the key. Companies like Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler had mastered mass production, had workforces numbering in the tens of thousands, had supply chains stretching across the continent. These companies were approached with contracts to produce not cars, but aircraft, tanks, and engines. Chrysler agreed to invest millions in new facilities to produce tanks and anti-aircraft guns. Ford built an entire mile-long assembly line at a facility called Willow Run to manufacture B-24 Liberator bombers. The scale was unprecedented. Willow Run alone would eventually employ 42,000 workers and produce a B-24 every 63 minutes at peak production. But factories were only part of the equation. Workers were needed, millions of them, and the traditional labor force of young men was rapidly being absorbed into the military. The solution came from demographics that had been largely excluded from industrial work. Women, African Americans, older workers, and people with disabilities. Rosie the Riveter became an icon, but she represented a real transformation in who could work in factories. Women learned to operate complex machinery, to weld aircraft fuselages, to rivet bomber wings. The demographics of American factory floors changed almost overnight, and production targets that had seemed impossible began to look achievable. The technical challenges were enormous. Aircraft manufacturing in 1940 was still more art than science, requiring skilled craftsmen who understood how to work with aluminum, how to rig control surfaces, how to install complex engines and systems. But American industry applied mass production principles with ruthless efficiency. Designs were simplified where possible, standardized to allow for interchangeable parts, broken down into sub-assemblies that could be manufactured in different locations, and then brought together for final assembly. The approach was wasteful in some ways, less elegant than German manufacturing methods. But it had one overwhelming advantage. It could be scaled up rapidly. By 1941, as America officially entered the war after Pearl Harbor, the production machine was already accelerating. Factories that hadn't existed 2 years earlier were churning out hundreds of aircraft monthly. Training programs were producing pilots, mechanics, and support personnel at rates that matched the aircraft production. Supply chains were established, bringing raw materials from across the continent and beyond. Aluminum from plants in Tennessee, steel from mills in Pennsylvania, rubber from synthetic plants built almost overnight. The entire American economy was being reorganized around a single goal: outproduce the enemy so thoroughly that victory becomes mathematically inevitable. The numbers, when they started coming in, were staggering in ways that Göring and his staff simply couldn't comprehend. In 1940, the year of Göring's mockery, the United States produced just over 12,000 military aircraft. This was already double the previous year's production, but it was just the beginning. In 1941, production jumped to 19,000. Then came 1942, and American factories delivered 47,000 aircraft. 1943 saw production explode to 86,000, and in 1944, the peak year, American industry produced an almost unbelievable 96,000 military aircraft. Let me break down what that means in practical terms. In 1944 alone, the United States built more aircraft than Japan produced during the entire war. That single year's American production exceeded Germany's total aircraft production from 1939 through 1943 combined. The Ford plant at Willow Run, that single facility, produced more than 18,000 B-24 Liberators during the war. That's more heavy bombers than the entire Luftwaffe possessed at the start of the war, all from one factory. And it wasn't just quantity. American designs evolved rapidly, incorporating combat lessons, adding features, improving performance. The P-51 Mustang, which would become one of the war's finest fighters, went from design to operational deployment in less than a year. To understand the scope of this achievement, consider the total numbers. From January 1940 to August 1945, American factories produced over 300,000 military aircraft. That's 300,000 planes, fighters, bombers, transports, trainers, reconnaissance aircraft, every type imaginable. And this production was achieved while simultaneously building the world's largest navy, producing tanks, trucks, artillery, ammunition, and everything else needed to fight a two-front war across two oceans. American industry wasn't just supporting American forces. Through Lend-Lease, American aircraft were supplied to Britain, the Soviet Union, and other allies. Soviet pilots flew American P-39 Airacobras. British bomber crews flew American B-24s and B-17. French resistance received American supplies delivered by American aircraft. The contrast with German production is stark and devastating. Germany, mobilized for war since 1933, with years of preparation and planning, with an industrial base considered among the world's finest, managed to produce approximately 116,000 aircraft from 1939 to 1945. That's total production over 6 years of war. The United States, starting from a far smaller base, producing nothing but consumer goods in 1939, exceeded that total in less than 4 years, and the qualitative gap, which had favored Germany in 1940, had evaporated by 1943. American fighters like the P-51 and P-47 were superior to their German counterparts. American bombers could strike targets the Luftwaffe couldn't dream of reaching. But beyond the raw numbers, there was a psychological dimension to American production that Göring completely failed to anticipate. American factories didn't just produce aircraft, they produced morale. Every month, as new production figures were published, as photographs of endless rows of bombers rolled off assembly lines, the message became clearer. Germany was being buried under an avalanche of American industrial might. Captured German documents and post-war interrogations revealed the impact this had on German planning. By 1943, German military leaders knew they were losing the production war. They knew that every aircraft they destroyed would be replaced within days. They knew that the Allied bombing campaigns, initially ineffective, were being sustained by seemingly unlimited replacement aircraft. The irony of Göring's position became almost tragic. The man who'd mocked American aircraft production, found himself presiding over the destruction of the Luftwaffe by those very same American aircraft. In 1943 and 1944, American bombers appeared over Germany in formations of hundreds, escorted by fighters that could match or exceed anything the Luftwaffe could field. German pilots, many of them veterans with hundreds of combat hours, found themselves overwhelmed not just by American skill, but by American numbers. They would shoot down bombers and watch as the formations kept coming, barely diminished. They would engage in dogfights against American fighters and find themselves outnumbered 3-1, 4-1, sometimes worse. Göring himself seems to have recognized his error relatively quickly, though he never publicly acknowledged it. In post-war interrogations, he admitted that German intelligence had largely believed Roosevelt's production figures, even if they dismissed them publicly. He acknowledged that American production, particularly the speed of Henry Kaiser's shipbuilding program, had surprised and upset German planners. There's a famous quote attributed to Göring from later in the war. "When I saw Mustangs over Berlin, I knew the jig was up." Whether he actually said it or not, the sentiment was accurate. The appearance of American long-range fighters over the German capital in 1944 meant that nowhere in Germany was safe from attack, that the Luftwaffe had lost the battle for air superiority, that the war was effectively over. The consequences of Göring's misjudgment and Germany's broader failure to understand American industrial capacity were catastrophic for the Nazi regime. The loss of air superiority meant that German cities could be systematically destroyed by bombing. It meant that the Wehrmacht's movements could be observed and attacked from the air. It meant that the D-Day invasion could proceed under an umbrella of Allied air power so overwhelming that German aircraft barely appeared over the beaches. It meant that German tank columns, once the terror of Europe, could be shredded by American fighter bombers. The Luftwaffe, which had seemed invincible in 1940, was by 1945 reduced to a token force, unable to defend German airspace, unable to support ground troops, reduced to watching helplessly as American and British bombers turned German cities into rubble. For Göring personally, the collapse of the Luftwaffe meant the collapse of his power and prestige. Hitler, who'd once considered Göring his heir apparent, became increasingly contemptuous as the air war turned against Germany. By 1943, Göring was avoiding Hitler, unable to face his wrath over the Luftwaffe's failures. The man who'd mocked American aircraft production spent the last years of the war in increasingly desperate circumstances, addicted to morphine, isolated from power, watching as everything he'd built was destroyed by the very forces he'd dismissed so contemptuously. In April 1945, as the war reached its final days, Hitler finally stripped Göring of all his offices and expelled him from the Nazi Party. The fall was complete. After the war, during the Nuremberg trials, Göring was confronted with the reality of American production. Prosecutors presented evidence of the aircraft, tanks, ships, and weapons that American industry had produced. The numbers were so large they seemed almost fictional, but they were real and verified. Göring, still defiant in many ways, could not deny the evidence. The refrigerator and razor blade manufacturer had outproduced the German war machine by a factor of nearly 3-1 in aircraft alone. The mockery had turned to ashes. Göring was convicted of war crimes and sentenced to death by hanging. In his final act of defiance, he took his own life by taking cyanide hours before his scheduled execution. He died knowing that his greatest misjudgment had contributed to the destruction of everything he'd fought for. The story of Göring's mockery and its aftermath carries lessons that resonate far beyond World War II. It's a reminder that underestimating potential adversaries is one of the cardinal sins of strategic planning. Göring looked at America and saw only its present state, not its latent capacity. He saw consumer goods production and dismissed it as irrelevant to military power, not understanding that the same industrial skills that made refrigerators could be adapted to make aircraft. He saw democracy and diversity as weaknesses, not understanding that these could be sources of strength and resilience. His failure was not just a failure of intelligence gathering, though German intelligence about American capacity was surprisingly poor. It was a failure of imagination, an inability to conceive that a society organized differently from Nazi Germany could actually be superior in industrial warfare. The contrast between Roosevelt's vision and Göring's mockery also highlights something profound about leadership and national strategy. Roosevelt understood that modern warfare had become industrial warfare, that victory would go not to the side with the best generals or bravest soldiers, but to the side that could produce more weapons, feed more armies, and sustain longer campaigns. He bet America's future on its industrial capacity, and he was proven spectacularly right. Göring, for all his combat experience and technical knowledge, was fighting the last war, believing that the lessons of 1918 and 1939 would hold true in 1944. He was wrong, and his wrongness cost millions of lives and destroyed his nation. Today, we remember Göring's refrigerators and razor blades quote as one of history's great examples of misplaced confidence. It stands alongside other infamous predictions like the war will be over by Christmas or the atomic bomb will never go off. But it's more than just a humorous example of someone being wrong. It's a case study in how military power is built, how industrial capacity translates into strategic capability, and how cultural assumptions can blind leaders to reality. The Americans could indeed build refrigerators and razor blades very well, and it turned out that the same industrial culture that made those consumer goods could be adapted to military production with devastating effectiveness. The transformation of American industry during World War II remains one of the most impressive organizational achievements in human history. In less than 5 years, the United States went from a third-rate military power with an outdated military to the dominant military force on the planet, armed with weapons that could strike anywhere, destroy anything, and produced in quantities that simply overwhelmed all opposition. That transformation was built on the very things Göring had mocked: American industrial know-how, democratic flexibility, and the productive capacity of a free market economy mobilized for war. The refrigerator makers became aircraft makers, and they buried the Luftwaffe under an avalanche of steel, aluminum, and explosive ordnance. So the next time you hear someone confidently predicting what their adversaries can or cannot do, remember Hermann Göring laughing about American aircraft production. Remember that the man who would build the Luftwaffe, who understood aviation intimately, who had every reason to feel confident, was so spectacularly wrong that his error helped lose a world war. Remember that potential matters more than present capability, that industrial capacity can be mobilized faster than anyone thinks possible, and that underestimating your opponents is the surest path to defeat. Roosevelt's 50,000 aircraft turned into 300,000, and Göring's mockery turned into a warning that echoes through history. Never, ever assume your enemy can't do something just because they haven't done it yet. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of history's great strategic miscalculations, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to Ignis Tempora for more stories about the moments that changed history. Drop a comment and let me know what other historical what-ifs or military blunders you'd like us to explore. Because history is full of moments when confidence met reality and reality won, and those stories never get old. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.